All right, so this is a really timely clip because we've heard a lot about the electoral process. We've heard a lot of people griping about the electoral college, who won the popular vote. So all of these things are pretty fresh in our mind. So it'll make this a little bit easier to learn. So this whole section is going to be on the electoral process. Okay, so it's election time. Now what? Every 4 years, our country holds a presidential election. The candidates debate, they hit the road talking to voters, and they put advertisements on television, radio, and the internet. All this hard work actually starts months and sometimes even years before Election Day in November. But what does it take to go from a hopeful candidate to a victorious president? The first public step a candidate has to take is to declare to the United States that he or she wants to be president. Then, candidates must get support for their campaign. They raise money, they get the attention of leaders on his or her political party, and they do a lot of footwork. Before all of that can even happen, a lot of times people with money will put out like feelers and do like they call people and they'll say, if this candidate did this, how would you feel? Because they want to get an idea of what do people think about this candidate before they even announce, and how do they change the way the public perceives those candidates. So there's a lot of like back behind the scenes work that goes on even before candidates declare. But the first formal step is to declare the candidacy. All right, so now you've declared. What happens next? Well, do you remember when the Republicans had like 15 people running for president last year? Yeah, it was a ton of people. So you have to narrow it down because they're not going to put 15 people on a ballot. So what happens? Candidates for the larger political parties are chosen at a party meeting called a convention. Every state has these, or every party has these conventions. These parties hold conventions at the local, state, and national levels. And there are two main ways the states send people to the national convention: the caucus and the primary. Both methods result in a set of delegates who will attend the national conventions. The delegates pledge when they attend the convention that they will vote for the candidate the state political party supports. So what happens in a caucus system, it's a little bit different than the primary. I've been a part of a caucus in Missouri. I've never been really involved, I guess, here in Hawaii. So I'm truthfully, I don't even know if you guys have a caucus or a primary system. So that might be a place that you could look at for your research project. But a caucus system is basically where a whole room full of people gets together and they discuss who they want to represent their party. And then they choose a few people to go to the next level, and then they represent that vote at the next level. And then those few people go to the next level, which is usually the state level. And then from the state level, they go to the national convention. But I don't, for a primary, which is what I believe Hawaii has, it's basically where everybody comes together from that party and they host a secret ballot, and then people vote who they want to represent the party at the national election. So a primary is more common than a caucus. So I'm assuming that Hawaii has a primary election rather than the caucus system. But what happens from either of these is that party delegates from each state are sent to the national conventions to select a nominee. Sorry, guys, I don't know what that sound is. So a lot of the time in a campaign season, you hear a lot about Iowa and New Hampshire, and there's a good reason for this. Iowa holds the first caucus of the season, so that kind of gives the candidates a good look into how are they going, like how are the states responding to their campaigning. And then next, New Hampshire holds the first primary election, and both of these happen in early February. So these are some of the first two important states that kind of voice what they want, because it really, I wouldn't say it influences the rest of the states, but it does give the candidates a good idea of how they measure up. All right, now nominations. So you've already decided that this is who you want to run. You have people supporting you at the state level from your caucus or your primary, and now what? The nominees are announced. Each party holds its national convention in huge arenas with balloons, confetti, funny-looking hats, and lots of media coverage. I'm sure you guys have seen that video of Hillary Clinton, like, looking at balloons, like, with a crazy face. Like, oh my goodness, look at that balloon. So I don't really know why we waste so much money on confetti and balloons, but both parties do. So that might be interesting if you wanted to marry economics in this unit. Like, how much money do parties waste on supplies or on materials or, that kind of stuff? I don't know. I think that'd be cool. Um, so next, the delegates are chosen from each state to discuss and debate the candidates. They listen to speeches, and they help create the party platform. Near the end of the multi-day convention, the delegates cast their votes for the party's nominee, who will run the national election. The president and the vice presidential nominees each make an acceptance speech, and that speech is meant to bring the party together and to support the nominees. Basically, it's a means for people to forget that your nominees have just fought against each other for the last 12 months. That it's like, okay, I know that I talked really badly about you before we got here, but now we're going to support each other. So kind of like Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders before the Democratic convention. Like, they were fighting against each other, and then afterwards Bernie was like, Hillary knows what's best. So it's interesting to see, how their values shift when they're backing the party. All right. So the presidential and vice presidential nominees, they make that acceptance speech, and then that's the first major step in getting the national campaign for president up and running. So this year, obviously, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump won that nomination, but there was a lot of controversy going into it, like regarding who were the candidates, how did they get the word out, and what did that look like. So this is a really hot button topic. So if it's something you're interested in, there's a lot you could work with here. All right, on the campaign trail. So now you've decided who you want to run. What do? How do they get the word out? There's several different ways. There are millions of dollars that are spent in the months leading up to the national conventions, but that's legitimately just the beginning. Once the field is narrowed down to two main party candidates, fundraising becomes even more important. There are only a few months before the general election, and each candidate needs to get his or her message out to the American public. The parties in each state help the candidates with paying the bills and organizing support. They do this in a couple of ways. So one way that they do this is through the political campaign. This is the process of gathering public support for a candidate. The goal of a campaign is to deliver as much information about the candidate and the party's platform to as many people as possible. And candidates campaign in a variety of ways. These ways could include direct mail, which is just sending informational packets to the voters, personal appearances, radio and TV appearances, debates and speeches, printed materials, which are posters, bumper stickers, leaflets, buttons, T-shirts, and the internet, emails, websites, videos, blogs, social networking. The internet is a really interesting one because, in the past, all you had were either ads that were created by the opponent and they made people look bad, or you had just their campaign material, and that obviously made them look good. But with the internet, you can grab these like short sound bites or these short videos, and if you just look at those short videos, you really might believe that Hillary Clinton is sick and old and lethargic, because of the way that we can use media to manipulate what people see. The same way, you might think that Donald Trump's speeches are all really shallow and lack substance. And now, we could argue, do they or do they not, because that's a whole other conversation. But depending on who creates those sound bites, that's what people are influenced by. So you heard a lot about after the election why people were shocked, like, holy cow, how could he get elected? Well, oftentimes we get kind of caught up in our internet side of the campaigning, and unfortunately that sometimes is very skewed depending on where we live. So it's important to know that, I think there's a saying, it's like trust 20% of what you see and believe 10% of what you hear. I really don't know how it goes. But I would encourage you to do a lot more research on any kind of campaigning if you're ever, going to vote in an election. I think it's really important to know what's going on. All right, election day. All of the efforts have led up to Election Day in November. People across the nation go to the polls and they select which candidate they want for the next president. As polls close from state to state, the news media reports who's getting the most votes. Then, the next morning, the media announces a winner of the popular vote, which is a tally of all of the votes cast. But this is just one step in the process of electing the president. This is really interesting because this is my first presidential election here in Hawaii, and it was like 5 p.m. and they were like, "Oh my gosh, Donald Trump won! How did that happen?" And where I'm from, like, we would go to bed and still not know who the president was. So it's kind of cool to see like how different regions experience that same experience. Does that make sense? So just really, I guess, eye-opening for me because all my life I remember going to sleep and waking up the next morning and being like, Barack Obama was president or whatever. But here, you learn on the same night, which is also kind of discouraging because your votes aren't done going in yet. But yeah, okay, that's neither here nor there. All right, so we have Election Day, the popular vote, and the Electoral College. So let's figure out exactly what that looks like. The Electoral College is basically a step that's required by the Constitution. Each state has a group of people, and they're called electors, and they cast the actual vote for president. When people vote for a presidential candidate, they are really voting to decide which candidate the electors in their state will vote for. In December, after the election, the electors meet in their state capitals and cast their ballots. The president of the Senate collects the votes and counts them. And in order to win, a candidate must have an absolute majority of the electoral votes, which means more than half of the votes. But what if there's a tie? If the electors' votes are split, then the full House of Representatives votes. And if that results in a tie, then the Senate votes. The elections of 1800 and 1824 both resulted in ties that were resolved by Congress. And on January 20th, the president-elect and vice president-elect take the oath of office and are inaugurated. So this is like, I'm totally all into Hamilton, right? Like the musical. So if you are into Hamilton also, you know that this hasn't always been the case. Like, before 1800, the president and the vice president, they didn't run together. They ran separately. So like, let's say that myself and Mr. Yoshida were running for president and I lost. He would become president and I would become his vice president. So can you imagine? We just spent the last year like tearing each other down and like, he's a bad guy, no, she's a dumb girl, like all of the back and forth fighting. And then we have to work together? Yeah, it's ridiculous, right? So it didn't really work. And that's why this process kind of came into play. How does the Electoral College work with the ballot? Because, the Electoral College has been the process, but the president and the vice president on a ticket has not. So it's interesting to see how our government has kind of morphed into what we see now throughout the years, because that's not necessarily what they had in mind whenever we had our first couple of presidents. But now let's talk about the electors in Hawaii, because this is important. I think this is super important. You find out how many electors your state has if you know how many representatives you have in Congress. So you have 2 representatives and you have 2 senators, right? So you have 4 electors total. That is not a whole lot of electors. So it's really important that, when you're looking at other states and you're seeing how they vote, you understand, like Hawaii, we have a large population on Oahu. We have, it's a giant economy for the amount of people that live here, but you only have 2 electors. So is that fair? Is that unfair? I don't know. I just think it's really important to understand, how do we decide how many electors a state has? All right. So at this point, you are done with this slide. There's a lot of ideas in here about things you could research, what you could be looking at. So at this time, go ahead and exit out of the slideshow. You're going to pull up the link for the quiz. So you're going to take a low-stakes quiz to get you ready. And then that practice quiz, make sure you have notes from it to use on your exam or on your quiz tomorrow. So we will be doing a quiz when you come into class tomorrow. So make sure you have those notes to help you on that. All right, guys, have a good night.